They offered us everything at first. That is the part nobody talks about anymore. We remember the ships, the way they blotted out the sun over Lisbon and Buenos Aires and Jakarta, shadow the size of continents sliding slow across the ocean, like the palm of some unimaginable hand pressing down. We remember the broadcast signal that rewrote itself into every frequency we had, the voice that came through in 92 languages simultaneously, perfectly grammatical in all of them, warm in none. We remember the ultimatum. We remember the silence that followed when we refused. What we don't talk about is the 3 weeks before all that. The gifts. They dropped the atmospheric purifiers first, each one the size of a grain elevator, gleaming and alien and utterly self-operating. 47 of them, scattered across every continent. Within 72 hours, particulate matter in the air over industrial cities dropped by 60%. The WHO confirmed it. Every government on Earth issued a statement that was some variation of cautious optimism. The Keth, as we came to call them, from their own designation for themselves, a sound like wind through corrugated steel, which we transliterated into something we could say at press conferences, seemed to be offering a transaction. They would heal our world. We would acknowledge their sovereignty over it. We said no, not unanimously, not cleanly, not without enormous and agonizing debate. But the species, in its collective and disorganized and gloriously stubborn way, said no. The atmospheric purifiers stopped working on a Tuesday. Then the bombs came down. My name is Carla Vasquez Neto, and I am going to tell you what I remember, not what I was told, not what was broadcast on the emergency frequencies in the early days when there were still emergency frequencies. What I saw with my own eyes, in the dark, underground, with 5 other people who were trying not to kill each other and mostly failing. Before the Keth, I was a structural engineer. I built things that were meant to hold weight, calculated load-bearing capacity and stress tolerances and the point at which a thing breaks. I was good at it. After the Keth, I was just a person in a hole, in the ground, and the things I knew how to calculate were different. How many days the water filter had left in it, how many calories were in the remaining protein rations divided by 6 people, at what point the ambient temperature in the lower corridor would begin to affect the medicine storage. The medicine. I'll get to the medicine. The bunker was a Cold War relic, retrofitted sometime in the 90s, and then largely forgotten by whoever had retrofitted it. It was underneath a former military research facility outside Évora, in Portugal's Alentejo region, cork oak country, flat and ancient and golden in the autumn, though we never saw that anymore. We got down there 8 days after the first atmospheric bombardment, when it became clear that the Keth's weapons weren't designed to kill people outright. They were designed to make the surface uninhabitable. They seeded the air with a particulate compound, a kind of weaponized dust that bonded with oxygen molecules and slowly replaced them with something our lungs couldn't process, not poisonous exactly, just not breathable. Slowly, incrementally, like someone very patient turning down a dial, going outside without a sealed suit, gave you roughly 4 hours before the symptoms started. 12 before they became serious. We learned this the hard way. There were 6 of us when we settled in for what we hoped was the short term and what became, as short terms do, a much longer one. Tomas, who had been a doctor and now was our doctor, a quiet man in his 50s who had been on his way to a conference in Évora, when the sky changed and had simply never made it back to wherever he was going. He spoke in a low, careful voice, and had a habit of touching the back of his neck when he was worried. He was almost always touching the back of his neck. Fernanda, retired schoolteacher from Beja, who was 71 years old and possessed of a stubbornness so total it functioned like a structural material. You could build things on it. She kept a small notebook in her breast pocket and wrote in it, every day, what she called her chronicle. She told us it was for posterity. We told her posterity was questionable. She kept writing. Daniel, 23, who had been doing agricultural work on a property nearby when the bombardment started, and who spoke very little, except when he had something worth saying, which was infrequent but always exactly right. Ines, who was 37, and had been a logistics coordinator for a humanitarian NGO, and who kept organizing things. The ration shelves, the equipment manifest, the rotating schedule of watch shifts, with the focused energy of someone who understood that if she stopped organizing she might start screaming. And Roke is the complicated part. He was a pharmacologist, which is relevant. I had not known any of them before the bunker. You don't choose your people in a situation like that. Whoever is in the same hole you've found, and you make it work, and if you're very lucky the work becomes something like love. In the beginning, we were lucky. The bunker had a 3-month supply of rations for 6 people, calculated conservatively. It had a water recycling system and a hand-crank generator and a library of physical books. Someone's whim, the person who had last retrofitted the place. And a medical bay that was better stocked than you would expect, though not as well stocked as Tomas would have liked. It had thick walls. It had no windows. It had the particular smell of enclosed space that after a while you stopped noticing, which was its own kind of mercy. What it had that first month was the quality of a held breath. We were waiting for the surface to be reclaimed, or for a signal from whoever was coordinating the resistance, or for the Keth to announce terms we could actually accept, or for something, anything, that would tell us which way the world had landed. The emergency frequencies had gone mostly to static by then. The ones that still broadcast were fragmented, sometimes looping, sometimes live, impossible to tell apart. We listened every night after dinner, all 6 of us sitting around the hand-crank radio like it was a campfire, and we didn't talk much, and occasionally Fernanda would write something in her notebook. Tomas had a story he told sometimes, when the silence got too heavy. A fable, he said his grandmother had told him, Portuguese, old enough that nobody knew the original source. The trees and the woodcutter. A woodcutter comes to a forest and asks the trees for a small branch to make a handle for his axe. The trees, being generous and seeing no harm in it, agree. The woodcutter makes his handle and then uses the axe, complete now, armed by the tree's own gift, to cut the forest down. Tomas didn't editorialize, he just told the story and let it sit there. We all understood what it meant. The Keth had asked us for something small, and we had, in the first 3 weeks, been tempted to give it to them. Most of us thought we had been right to refuse most of the time. The medicine was discovered on day 46. Roke found it in a supply room that none of us had catalogued properly. A back corridor, a metal shelving unit behind a collapsed rack of what turned out to be spare parts for a ventilation system we weren't even using. Cases of sealed pharmaceutical containers, military labeling, dated 15 years prior. Tomas identified them. He came to find me while I was checking the water filter. And he stood in the doorway and said my name once in a particular tone, and I followed him back to the supply room without asking why. The drug was an antiviral compound, experimental at the time it had been stored there, which meant it had never entered civilian distribution. It was also, Tomas explained carefully, sitting on an overturned crate and touching the back of his neck, theoretically effective against the Keth's particulate weapon. Not a cure, not a reversal, but a mitigation. Something that could allow a person to function on the surface for significantly longer than 4 hours. Maybe indefinitely, if the dosing was right. He'd read about it in a paper published 18 months before the invasion. He hadn't thought it was in production anywhere. How much, I asked. Enough for 1 person, he said. For an extended period. Or for 3 people, shorter term. Or for 6 people, short enough to matter but not enough to be decisive. We sat with that for a while. I should tell you that I had believed, in the first month, that we were a community. 6 peoples in a sealed space, making collective decisions, pooling knowledge. The radio watch rotated. The cooking rotated. Fernanda's chronicle, she always said, was for all of us. I had believed we were a demonstration of something. The part of being human that wasn't about competition. Part that could look at a shrinking resource and say, we all share this or none of us do. I was a structural engineer. I understood, intellectually, that every structure has a load-bearing capacity and a point at which it breaks. The argument started that night. It was not the argument I expected, not crude, not selfish, at least not immediately. Roke made the case, calmly and with evident sincerity, that the medicine should be used by whoever could accomplish the most on the surface. He meant himself. He said this without quite saying it, but we all understood what he meant. He was the pharmacologist. He knew how the compound worked. He could potentially synthesize more of it, if he had access to a laboratory. which there was known to be one in a ruined pharmaceutical research center, 14 kilometers away. Give me the medicine. In the careful language of a man who had spent his career arguing with grant committees, and I can get you more of it. Give me the medicine, and I multiply it. It sounded reasonable. It was That was the difficulty. Reasonable arguments are the most dangerous kind because they make you feel like refusing them is the unreasonable position. Daniel said quietly that he didn't trust a plan that began with giving one person everything. Ines said that if any one of us were going to the surface alone, they needed backup. The plan required at least 2 people. Fernanda said nothing for a long time. Then she opened her notebook and read us something she had written 3 weeks ago, when we'd been running low on water filters and had discussed rationing. We are the same people above ground and below it. She closed the notebook. The surface doesn't change that, she said. Roque said that sentiment was admirable, but sentiment was going to get us all killed in a bunker when the rations ran out. That was when the held breath broke. I am not going to pretend the next 2 weeks were clean. They weren't. We divided, the way groups divide, not all at once but in the slow fracturing way, a hairline crack that widens under load. Roque and Daniel seemed like the most natural alliance, given their shared practicality. Discovered they disagreed about almost everything except the fact of the disagreement. Ines reorganized the ration shelves twice a day and nobody touched them. Fernanda kept writing in her notebook. I found myself talking to Tomas at night, sitting at the end of the lower corridor with the lights turned low, and he was the one who told me things I needed to hear. Every group in every crisis I've ever read about did this, he said once. Not the bad ones. All of them. The good ones too. He paused. The ones that made it through did it differently at the end than at the beginning. How? They stopped asking who deserved the medicine, he said. They started asking what the medicine was for. I thought about that for a long time. Fernanda had a dream. She told us about it at breakfast one morning, 3 days after things between Roque and Daniel had reached a point where we were having meals in shifts to avoid the particular silence that had developed between them. She described it in the way she told everything, clearly, without embellishment, treating the dream as factual record. She was in a forest, she said, not a Portuguese forest. Something bigger and older, and there were trees being cut down all around her, and she kept looking for the woodcutter, but she couldn't find him. And then she understood. The woodcutter was all of them. Not one person with an axe. All of them taking turns, each one justifying their cut as the last necessary one. She looked at Roque when she said this, and then she looked at me, and then at Daniel and Ines and Tomas in turn, equal and steady. She wasn't accusing. She was including. That was the morning the argument changed. I laid it out the way I would lay out a structural problem. Not what any one of us deserved, but what the situation required. Tomas knew the compound's pharmacology, knew synthesis. If anyone could get to that lab and understand what equipment was there and what was possible, it was him. The calculation only worked if both of them went. And both of them going meant dividing the available medicine between 2 people. Instead of concentrating it in one, which meant shorter individual coverage but redundancy. If one of them went down on the surface, the other could still function. They would need someone who knew the terrain. Daniel had worked that land for 3 years. He knew every building, every road, every place the Keth surveillance patterns had gaps. We'd been tracking those patterns on the radio, and Daniel had been keeping a map in his head that nobody had thought to ask him about until Ines, reorganizing something, found his handwritten notes. 3 people, divided medicine, more risk per person, less catastrophic failure overall. A plan that held weight. Roque asked who decided this. I said we all did, right now together, or we didn't do it at all. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, the synthesis. If the lab has what I think it has, could produce enough for all of us, enough for people beyond us. That's what we're betting on, I said. And if we're wrong, then we're wrong together. I can't tell you the moment it shifted. There isn't one clean moment. Roque looked at Daniel, and Daniel looked at the map he'd drawn from memory, and something eased between them. Not forgiveness exactly, more like the recognition that they had been arguing about the wrong thing. They had been arguing about the medicine. They should have been arguing about what came next. We spent 4 days preparing. Ines took the three-way medicine division and calculated exposure windows with the kind of methodical obsessiveness that I had initially found. Exhausting and now understood was the thing that kept us from doing everything wrong. Tomas briefed Roque on the dosing, and Roque briefed Tomas on what to watch for in the others. Fernanda wrote everything down in her notebook, not just for posterity now but for us. A record of what we decided and why, so that in the corridor at 2 in the morning when doubt came, anyone could read it back. Daniel packed the supply kit. He was efficient about it in a way that made you understand he had done this kind of thing before, though he'd never talked about it. He added a hand tool at the last minute, some agricultural implement I didn't recognize, purposed. I wasn't sure for what, I didn't ask. He would need it for something. He tended to be right about that kind of thing. The night before they left, Tomas told the story again. The trees and the woodcutter. This time, he told it differently. Not stopping at the cutting but continuing, following some variant of the fable I hadn't heard before, or maybe inventing it. In this version, one of the trees doesn't give away the branch, and the forest survives. But the tree is alone now, in a cleared field with no forest around it, and the woodcutter comes back anyway, and the lone tree, singular and unbent, watches him coming and does nothing, because there is nothing one tree can do alone. He stopped there. That's not a happy ending either, Ines said. No, Tomas said. But it's a true one. The whole forest has to decide together, not one tree. We didn't sleep much that night, Fernanda wrote. I ran structural calculations in my head. Not the new kind, but the old kind, load and stress and tolerance, the language I'd learned before the world changed. I found it comforting. The numbers were honest. They told you exactly where a thing would hold and where it would give. At 5 in the morning, in the dark, Daniel, Roque, and Tomas suited up. The suits were inadequate, patched together from the hazmat gear that had been in the bunker's emergency supply, jury-rigged with additional sealing material, and the improvised filters Roque had constructed over the previous weeks from components Ines had inventoried. They would not have passed any safety inspection that had ever existed. They were what we had, paused at the inner door of the airlock. He looked back at the three of us who were staying. Ines, Fernanda, me. He looked specifically at Fernanda. Write it down, he said, not sarcastically. He meant it. She already had the notebook open, the outer door sealed. The Keth we had learned from the fragmentary signals and from Roque's expertise in the compound they'd deployed, communicated chemically. Not in the way we meant when we said chemical communication, not like ants, but something far more complex. Their individual cognition was not separable from their group cognition in the way ours was. They didn't have leaders because they didn't have followers. They had consensus that propagated through their biology, like a signal through a wire. Their decisions emerged from all of them simultaneously. This was, Tomas had pointed out once, both their greatest strength and the thing that made us most dangerous to them. They couldn't understand why we refused their offer. Tactically, strategically, philosophically. The offer had been logical. The refusal was irrational. An entity whose cognition was collective could not comprehend an entity whose cognition was individual and who chose, against all apparent self-interest, to remain individual. They kept expecting us to come to our senses. They kept expecting the refusal to collapse into compliance the way their own internal dissent would have been absorbed back into the collective will. They didn't understand that our stubbornness wasn't a temporary state. It was a feature. While we waited in the bunker, through the 2 days that Tomas and Roque and Daniel were on the surface, Fernanda told me things she hadn't said before. She talked about her students. 23 years of them, different cohorts, the same essential group. Children who didn't understand yet what they were capable of, who needed someone to hold a space open so they could find out. She talked about a student she'd had years ago who had refused to read aloud in class because he was ashamed of a stutter, and how she had spent a month finding a way around the shame without ever naming it, until the day he read a full page aloud without thinking about it, and then looked up and understood what had just happened to him, and grinned. That's what I keep writing about, she said. Not the crisis, the grin. Ines was monitoring the radio. She had a system. She always had a system. A set of frequencies and times and signal patterns that she checked in rotation, looking for anything coherent. On the second morning, she found something. A coordinated signal from what turned out to be a resistance network, operating out of the Basque country, connected to nodes in northern Morocco and somewhere in southern England. They were alive. They were coordinating. They had information about the Keth surveillance dead zones, information that overlapped with Daniel's mental map in ways that made Ines sit very still for a moment and then begin writing very fast. We weren't alone in the hole. We had just been unable to find each other. Came back on the afternoon of the second day. Daniel and Tomas were 20 minutes behind him, and for those 20 minutes, I stood at the inner airlock door and did not calculate anything, because calculation required a steady mind, and mine wasn't. Then the outer door cycled and the three of them came through, and Roque sat down on the floor of the decontamination bay and said, with the particular flatness of someone who is very tired and very careful about emotion, "The lab had what I needed. The synthesis would take 6 weeks. The compound could be produced in sufficient quantity, Roque estimated, to supply the people they had identified on the radio network. Potentially more. The Keth's particulate weapon had a counter. Not a reversal, not a reclamation of the atmosphere, not a return to what had been, but a sufficiency. Enough to move, to gather, to coordinate, to be on the surface long enough to refuse." Tomas had his hand on the back of his neck, but he was smiling. "I want to tell you what Daniel had brought the tool for." I asked him afterward. While Roque was setting up the synthesis equipment, we'd hauled back in 3 heavy bags, and Ines was relaying their surface intelligence to the resistance network, and Daniel looked at his hands for a moment before answering. "There was a grove," he said. "Olive trees. Old ones. The kind that have been there since before anyone remembers. The Keth's compounds don't seem to affect them. I don't know why." He paused, took a cutting. "In case." He reached into the side pocket of his pack and pulled out a sealed container, the kind you use for biological samples, purposed from Tomas's medical kit. Inside, wrapped in damp cloth, was a small green cutting, still alive. I thought about the fable, about the forest that gives away a branch and loses itself, about the lone tree that refuses and survives but stands alone. I looked at the cutting, one branch, taken willingly, for something entirely different than an axe handle. "What are you going to do with it?" I asked. "Plant it," he said. "When we can go back outside." "That'll take years," I said. "Yes," he said, "but something has to be first." The Keth did not understand us. That is the central fact of everything that followed, though it would take years for the consequence to fully develop. They understood our biology and our chemistry and our infrastructure. They had clearly studied us, possibly for longer than we had any way of knowing. What they had not been able to model was the thing that made us refuse the offer. And the same thing that made 6 people in a sealed underground room nearly destroy their community over a supply of medicine and then not quite. They couldn't model the grin. The reason a man plants an olive tree that will take years to fruit, in a world that might not survive that long. The specific irrationality of hope, maintained past the point where rationality could justify it. They had come to us with a transaction. Give us sovereignty, receive healing. We had looked at the transaction and seen the woodcutter's axe in it, and refused. Not because we were certain we could survive the refusal, because we were certain we couldn't survive the compliance. What they could not understand, what their collective cognition, their beautiful distributed consensus, had no architecture to represent, was that we had made the same decision in the bunker. Roque could have taken the medicine. He had the most logical claim. In any pure calculation of instrumental value, concentrating the resource in the most capable individual made sense. He nearly did it. We nearly let him. And then we chose differently. Not because the calculation changed, because we were not purely calculating creatures. We were something else, something that would divide a resource 3 ways, and accept the reduced individual odds in exchange for something the math couldn't name. The Keth came back 18 months later. Smaller fleet, different tone. They had apparently been trying to understand the refusal. By then, Proke's compound was in broad distribution across the resistance network. Fernanda's chronicle had been transcribed and was being read in shelters on 4 continents. Daniel's olive cutting was in the ground outside the bunker entrance, in a small cleared plot that Ines had designed with the same obsessive care she applied to everything. It was 4 inches tall and growing. We were on the surface when the second fleet arrived, all 6 of us, in the morning light of the Alentejo, which was still hazy from the Keth's compounds but getting clearer, incrementally, measurably, documented weekly in Inez's records. The sky was a color that was not quite right yet, a silver yellow instead of blue, but it was a sky, and we were under it. The Keth signal came in through the same 92 languages, the same perfect grammar. They wanted to resume negotiations. I looked at Tomas, who had his hand off the back of his neck for once. He nodded. I looked at Fernanda, opened her notebook. I looked at Roque, who had not slept in 40 hours, and looked like a man who was at peace with that. I looked at Daniel, beside his olive cutting, checking the soil moisture, with 2 fingers the way he checked everything, methodically, without drama, trusting what he found. I looked at Ines, who had already pulled out the frequency log and begun taking notes. I looked at all of them, and I thought about load-bearing capacity, about what a structure can hold, about the places it gives and the places it doesn't. We had been 6 strangers who found the same hole, and nearly tore each other apart over a box of medicine. We had told that story the way Fernanda told everything, clearly, to the network, so they would know what to expect of themselves when it happened to them. It had happened to a lot of them. It happened to all of them, eventually. The groups that made it through were the ones who remembered they were asking the wrong question, and changed it. Tomas told the Keth's representative, through the radio, calmly, in the same level voice he used for everything, that we would talk, on certain conditions. The conditions were not complicated. They were the kind of thing that sounds obvious until a moment arrives when it isn't. We would negotiate together, all of us. Not a representative for a collective, not a leader who spoke for followers. We would decide together what we could offer and what we couldn't, and nothing would be offered on our behalf that hadn't been decided that way. The Keth's representative was silent for 11 seconds. We know because Ines timed it. Then it said, in all 92 languages, that it would convey the terms. Daniel was still looking at his cutting. He touched one small leaf, just touched it with the tip of one finger, checking whether it was real, whether it would hold. It held. Fernanda wrote it down. 6 weeks is a long time underground. I should say something about what those 6 weeks looked like, because it is easy to describe them as a waiting period, a gap between the departure and the return, between the mission and its outcome, but that would be wrong. The 6 weeks of synthesis were their own kind of work, and the work was us. Roque spent most of it in the medical bay, which he had converted into a lab as thoroughly as its limited footprint would allow. He'd mapped every piece of equipment in the pharmaceutical research center, had brought back what would fit in a pack, and spent the first 4 days integrating it with what we already had. The improvised cold storage, repurposed coolant from the bunker's old climate system, rigged with a thermostat that Ines had rebuilt from components Daniel had identified in a storage cabinet, was the piece he was most worried about. Temperature variance would degrade the synthesis product. He checked the thermostat 3 times a day. After day 12, he stopped explaining why and just checked it, which is a different kind of worry, the kind that has integrated itself into the body. Daniel took over the water filtration completely, not because I couldn't manage it, I had been managing it, but because he asked to, and when I asked him why, he said he wanted something he could see the results of every day. The filter produced clean water. The amount was measurable. The result was clear. He needed that. I understood it. Learned to understand a lot of things about people when you live with them in a space with no windows. Fernanda had a second notebook now. She had filled the first. The second one had started as a continuation of the chronicle, but had developed, she told me, into something she wasn't quite sure what to call. Letters, maybe, though she hadn't decided who they were addressed to. Not us, she talked to us. Not posterity in the abstract. Something more specific. She said maybe she'd figure it out when she was done with it. Ines had made contact with the resistance network in earnest now. She had a schedule of contact windows and a protocol she had worked out with the Basque node, coded, Not in any sophisticated, cryptographic sense, just in the way that people who don't want to be heard develop ways of not being heard, which is mostly about rhythm and pattern, rather than content. The network was larger than any of us had known. It spanned what had been Southern Europe and was reaching into sub-Saharan Africa, into the mountain communities of South America. There were people who had been underground longer than us. There were people who had found ways to the surface that we hadn't considered. There was a community in what had been the Scottish Highlands that had been living on the surface, continuously using improvised filters derived from ununderlying chemistry as Roca's compound, developed independently, through different means, arriving at adjacent answers. Ines told Roque about it. He sat for a moment and then laughed. Really laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from genuine astonishment, and said, "Of course they did." "Of course who did?" Ines asked. "People," he said. "Of course people did. We're annoyingly good at this." I thought about that at night, in the lower corridor, where I had taken to sitting when I couldn't sleep. The bunker had an odd acoustic property in that corridor. Sounds from the lab and from the main common area blurred together into a low ambient texture. Not quite music, but not quite noise. I could hear Roque's movements in the lab. I could hear Ines murmuring into the radio during contact windows. Sometimes I could hear Daniel turning pages in the book library, going through it systematically from one end, the way he did most things. It occurred to me, sitting there, that I was listening to people surviving. Not heroically, just continuing. Making coffee when there was coffee to make, keeping the thermostat checked, writing down whatever needed to be written down. The structural engineering term for this is redundancy. You build in more support than the minimum load requires. Because loads are variable and minimums are theoretical, you don't trust a single point of failure. You distribute. You make the structure resilient not through the strength of any one element, but through the multiplication of them. Through the relationships between them. Through the way they bear each other's weight, when any one of them is temporarily at its limit. I had not understood, when I was designing buildings, that this was also how you built people. On day 31, the Keth changed their pattern. Ines noticed it first. The surveillance sweeps. The way the Keth's sensor drones moved across the landscape, she had been tracking through the radio interference they created. A specific kind of static at predictable intervals. Shifted. The intervals shortened. The patterns became less regular. Whatever they were doing on the surface, they had changed their approach. We didn't know what it meant. Roque's best guess was that they had detected the synthesis activity. Some chemical signature leaking through the bunker's filtration. Something they could read. Or they had found the Pharmaceutical Research Center and understood what had been taken from it. They were responding to something in the network's activity that Ines and the others had inadvertently made visible. "Does it change anything?" Daniel asked. "No," I said. "We're not done." "Then no," he said. "This is the thing that doesn't get reported clearly, in the accounts you've probably heard. The moments that sound like courage are usually just the moments when there is no meaningful alternative. Stopping the synthesis because the Keth had changed their patrol pattern would have been as irrational as it would have been sensible. We were 5 weeks in. We were not going to be 5 weeks in for nothing. So we kept going, the same way you keep going at most things. Not through any single act of heroism, but through the accumulated small decisions not to quit. On day 39, we lost power to the backup generator for 6 hours. Ines traced the fault to a corroded coupling in the fuel line. It was a fixable problem. She fixed it. The thermostat in the lab had deviated by 4 degrees during the outage, put Roque through a contained crisis that he managed by sitting very still for 90 seconds, and then recalculating the synthesis timeline, extending it by 5 days and going back to work without comment. On day 42, one of the Keth's drones passed directly over the bunker entrance. We heard it. A low subsonic resonance that came through the concrete walls, lasting maybe 15 seconds. Then it moved on. We didn't speak for a while after that. On day 45, Daniel asked Tomas to teach him something medical. Anything, he said, just something to know. Tomas, who had been teaching Fernanda basic first aid for weeks, considered the request, and then spent the next 3 hours teaching Daniel how to set up Simple fracture and dress a wound under contaminated conditions. Daniel was a serious student. He repeated back every step before moving to the next one. Why now? I asked Tomas afterward. He wanted to know something that would be useful to the people on the network, Tomas said. Something that isn't just terrain. On day 47, completed the synthesis. He didn't make an announcement. He came out of the lab and set a sealed container on the table in the common area and looked at it for a moment and then looked at all of us and said, "It works. I tested it twice. It works." Fernanda wrote it down. The distribution plan was Inez's, of course, because distribution plans were Inez's natural territory. She had already been coordinating with the network for 3 weeks in anticipation of this moment, mapping the most urgent nodes, calculating transport routes that would use the Keth's changed patrol pattern as cover rather than obstacle. The gaps in their new irregularity were different from the old ones, but they were still gaps, because no surveillance system, chemical, biological, technological, can be everywhere at once. This was something the Keth had not fully accounted for. They had designed their patrols for efficiency. Humans, NAS had found, were very good at finding the inefficiencies. It took 2 months to get the compound to the highest priority nodes. Some of it traveled in the backpacks of people moving between shelters, carrying sealed containers alongside ration supplies and medical gear. Some of it was left in agreed dead drop locations that the network exchanged coordinates for over the radio, in the rhythmic coded patterns that had nothing to do with cryptography and everything to do with how two people in different holes learn to understand each other. Some of it reached people we never knew. That is not a tragedy. It is, in fact, the point. We went to the surface in stages. First Roque and Daniel, to re-establish the route to the Pharmaceutical Research Center, which they had decided to expand into a proper production facility. Then Tomas, who had identified a field hospital that the network had established in an old agricultural complex 15 kilometers south, and who was needed there. Then Ines, who had been coordinating the network's communication structure remotely, and who needed to be physically present at the Basque node to train the people there in the protocols she had developed. Fernanda and I went together. The Alentejo in that light, even wrong, even silver yellow instead of what it should have been, was very large. I had forgotten how large the world was. Underground, you learn to think in corridors and rooms and measured spaces. The surface has no edges you can see. It goes on. Fernanda stood for a long time, not moving. Then she wrote something in her notebook. I didn't ask what. Some things are private, even at the end of the world. We walked to where Daniel had planted the cutting, in the small cleared plot outside the bunker entrance. It was 11 inches tall now. The soil around it was darker where Ines had amended it over the previous weeks. There was nothing dramatic about it. It was a very small olive tree in a field that had been through a lot, doing what olive trees do, which is mostly endure. Do you think it'll be like, Fernanda said, when it's full grown? Messy, I said. Olives are messy trees. Good, she said. The second Keth contact happened, because they could not stop trying to understand us. That is what the xenolinguist who was part of the resistance network told us. Later, when we had established enough of a working relationship with the network that expertise could actually be deployed, rather than just survived. The Keth's collective cognition made them extraordinarily efficient at certain things. They processed information across the group, the way we process information within a brain, and their models of other systems were usually very accurate very quickly. But we had generated data that did not fit their models, and they had been trying for 18 months to generate models that would fit our data, and they couldn't. Not because we were more intelligent, because we were incoherent in specific ways that their coherence made invisible. We refused the transaction, and then we nearly destroyed ourselves, arguing about a scarcity. And then we didn't destroy ourselves, and we made an alternative plan. And the alternative plan worked in ways that couldn't have been predicted from the individual capabilities of the people involved. The whole was different from the sum of its parts in a direction their models didn't have a word for. The closest translation the xenolinguist could construct was something like productive irrationality. The Keth found this distressing. They kept coming back to it. The second contact, accordingly, was not an ultimatum. It was, in the Keth's way, a question. They wanted to know why we had refused. Not strategically, they had modeled the strategic dimension thoroughly. They wanted to know the reason underneath the reason. The thing that had made the refusal so possible, or inevitable, or whatever it was. Tomas answered, "I don't know exactly what he said. I wasn't on the radio when it happened." But Ines took notes, and what he said, as nearly as the xenolinguist could render it in the Keth's framework, was this. We refused because the transaction required us to be something other than what we were. And what we were was not negotiable. Not our biology, not our infrastructure, not our governance, what we were. The stubbornness, the irrationality, the specific way we divided medicine 3 ways and accepted worse, individual odds in exchange for something the math couldn't name. The grin, the olive tree, the notebook, all of it was the same thing. Take the transaction, accept the cure, acknowledge the sovereignty, and we would survive. But the thing that had survived would not be us. The Keth were silent for 23 seconds. We know because Ines timed it. Then they said they would need to discuss. We told them we understood. There is a version of this story that ends with a victory. A clean line. The Keth withdrew, the atmosphere recovered, the world was rebuilt, humanity was fine. That version is not wrong exactly. But it leaves out the part that I think matters most, which is not the ending but the middle. 6 people in a room underground, dividing medicine, nearly breaking, deciding not to, writing it down, telling it to the network so they would know it was coming, so they would know they were not the first to nearly break. The network, when it eventually collected the accounts from every shelter that had gone through the equivalent of our 2 weeks, found that the pattern was nearly universal. Scarcity, conflict, near fracture, and then, usually, not always, but usually, a moment when someone asked the wrong question in the right way, or told a story that reframed the problem, simply refused to stop writing in a notebook. The groups that didn't make it through mostly broke on specific points, took everything. Or, when the group decided that the group no longer existed and stopped acting as one, the groups that made it through mostly did it by accident, or by stubbornness, by the presence of one person who kept acting as though they were all still in it together, until enough other people did too. I keep thinking about Fernanda's dream. The forest and the woodcutter, the way she looked at each of us in turn, not accusing, including. The woodcutter was all of them. Not the enemy, all of them. And the forest survived not because the woodcutter was defeated but because the trees, at each other and understood they were the same thing. We are on the surface now. The sky is getting better, not fast, not completely, measurably, in the way that Ines records make clear. The olive tree is 19 inches tall. Roke's compound has a name in the network, a nickname people use for it that I will not repeat here, because he finds it embarrassing and he deserves some peace. Fernanda has a 4th notebook. Keth's discussions are ongoing. We are patient. We have learned to be patient. Underground, you run the calculations. Above ground, you wait for the results. In either case, the math is the same. The structure holds as long as you keep checking the things that need to be checked, and you keep the people who need the medicine close enough to give it to them. And you trust that what has held so far will keep holding. And you watch with your 2 fingers in the soil for what is growing. It grows.